The liquidation. They didn't knock. They didn't send a diplomatic cable. They didn't wait for a consensus at the UN. At 0200 hours, the United States military didn't just breach a palace. They breached a vault. The headlines called it Operation Absolute Resolve. The talking heads on the Sunday morning shows called it a coup. But if you stop listening to the politics and start following the money, you'll see it for what it truly was: a repossession.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about. We want peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela, and that includes many from Venezuela that are now living in the United States and want to go back to their country. It's their homeland.
January 5th, the first trading day of 2026. While the world was reeling from the images of a blindfolded Nicolás Maduro in a Manhattan courtroom, Wall Street was having a risk-on feast. Gold just screamed to $4,400 an ounce. That's the fear index at work. The sound of smart money fleeing into the bunkers. But look at the oil patch. Chevron, the only American major that had the stomach to stay in the Venezuelan trenches, is up 7% before the first cup of coffee. Halliburton and Schlumberger? They're ripping double digits. Why? Because the Doctrine just went live. It's a simple, brutal evolution of American foreign policy. If you sit on the world's largest oil reserves and you default on your debt to the dollar system, the Repo man is coming for your keys. This wasn't an invasion for democracy. It was a debt collection for the Petrodollar. For 20 years, $17 trillion in collateral has been locked behind a wall of sanctions and socialist mismanagement. The United States didn't just demand a change in leadership. They just cut the lock on the world's largest gas tank. The message to every other distressed asset in the Western Hemisphere is now loud and clear. Pay your debts to the Greenback or prepare for a liquidation event. The 17 trillion collateral. If you want to understand why the U.S. Navy is currently sitting off the coast of Caracas, ignore the rhetoric about democracy. Don't look at the politicians. Look at the dirt. This is the Orinoco Belt. It's not just an oil field. It's a geological freak of nature. 303 billion barrels of proven reserves. That is 17% of the entire planet's oil sitting right in our backyard, less than 5 days by tanker from the Texas coast. At today's prices, that dirt is worth $17 trillion. To put that in perspective, it's nearly half of the U.S. national debt, which just surged past $38.5 trillion. In the cold, hard logic of the Treasury, this isn't a nation, it's a balance sheet. For 50 years, the petrodollar was a handshake. You buy oil, you use dollars. But in 2024 and 2025, that handshake started to slip. The BRICS bloc launched the unit, a gold-backed settlement mechanism. De-dollarization wasn't a theory anymore. It was a leak in the hull of American hegemony. The capture of Maduro was a foreclosure. Washington didn't just take a leader. They seized the ultimate physical asset. In a world of eroding trust in paper money, the U.S. just secured the largest undeveloped hydrocarbon pool on Earth to back the Greenback. It's not just energy. It's collateral for the world's reserve currency. But there's a catch. This isn't the light, sweet stuff you find in West Texas. This is Venezuelan heavy, extra heavy crude, grading at 12 degrees API. It's dense. It's sour. It's basically liquid asphalt. And that's exactly why we need it. Billions were spent between 1990 and 2010 to optimize the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries. These massive industrial crackers are hungry for this specific heavy sludge. Our refineries were built for this oil, literally. Without it, they've been thirsting, forced to pay a premium to Canada just to keep the fractionating towers running. The U.S. isn't after cheap gas for your SUV. They're after the feedstock that fuels the American industrial machine. By controlling the Orinoco, we've secured the only crude that our most complex refineries were designed to eat. If you find this investigation valuable, hit the like button and share this video with someone who support helps us bypass the algorithm and bring these hidden financial mechanisms to light. Leave a comment below with the word time print. And finally, subscribe to join the 10% who are mastering the lessons time insists we keep learning. Now back to the forensics. The Chevron head start. When Hugo Chavez nationalized Venezuela's oil fields in 2007, he didn't just seize assets, he staged a revolution for the cameras. Foreign companies were kicked out at gunpoint, infrastructure was taken over by the state, and billions of dollars in American capital were wiped off the global ledgers overnight. Most CEOs took the hint. They packed their bags, filed their lawsuits, and fled. Every major player left the building, except one. Chevron didn't flee. While Exxon and ConocoPhillips spent the next decade in the dry, sterile rooms of international arbitration courts in The Hague, Chevron was playing a much longer, much more dangerous game. They didn't sue for the past. They negotiated for the future. They cut surgical deals with the Maduro regime. They navigated a minefield of U.S. sanctions through a complex labyrinth of Treasury Department waivers. They maintained their 20% stake in joint ventures like Petropier and Petroboscan when everyone else said it was impossible. This wasn't just about survival. It was about market intelligence. For nearly 2 decades, Chevron kept its footprint, its technicians, and, most importantly, its proprietary data on the ground. While the rest of the world relied on grainy satellite images, Chevron's engineers were physically monitoring reservoir pressures. They knew which wells were still viable. They knew which pipelines were rusting into the sand, and which ones could be brought back online with a single capital injection. Now, in the post-Maduro landscape of 2026, that quiet persistence has paid off with a staggering first-mover advantage. While the other majors scramble to remap a country they haven't seen in 20 years, Chevron is already positioned. They aren't just drilling for new oil. They're unlocking old wells that they carefully kept on life support through 2 decades of socialist chaos. The corporate line is always the same. Our focus is the safety of our people and the integrity of our assets. But in the back rooms of Wall Street, they're using a different term. Analysts are calling Chevron the energy protectorate. They have become the preferred contractor for the American repossession, the only firm with the keys to the engine room. Price targets for CVX have surged past $172 a share. Why? Because the other majors now face a cold, hard truth. They're starting at zero. Chevron, meanwhile, is already tapping the spigot. They aren't just getting access to oil, They're getting a generational head start on the most complex hydrocarbon play on Earth. This isn't just about a quarterly profit. It's about total, strategic market dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Debt for equity, the New Deal, $200 billion. That is the price of 20 years of socialist mismanagement, corruption, and systemic decay. Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's the world's most insolvent nation, owing a mountain of debt to everyone from Beijing bondholders to Moscow oil czars. For years, the regime played these creditors against each other, promising barrels that didn't exist to pay for loans that had already been looted. But the Repo man just rewrote the rules of international bankruptcy. In the chaotic hours following Maduro's capture, a new hierarchy of creditors emerged. China and Russia, who poured $60 billion into the regime to secure their own energy future, just found themselves at the back of a very long line. The message from Washington is crystal clear. American claims come first. ConocoPhillips is seeking $12 billion for its stolen assets. Exxon is looking for nearly $2 billion. These aren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They are the legacy of a 2-decade-old theft. Washington isn't asking for permission anymore. They're here to collect the principal, the interest, and the late fees. State debt official said, "Venezuela cannot be an operational hub for our adversaries. Our companies were robbed, and we are going to ensure they are the first to be made whole." But there's a problem. The vault in Caracas is empty. There's no cash to cut a check. So the White House offered a new deal. They call it a debt for equity swap, but in the oil patch, it's being called the Reconquista. It is a brutal form of corporate tough love. The White House told the oil majors, "You want your billions back? Fine. But we aren't writing you a check. You have to go back in. You use your own capital to fix the rusted pipelines, the looted rigs, and the broken refineries that have been rotting for 20 years. Once you start pumping, you keep the oil until the ledger is balanced." This is the total death of the nationalized model. For 70 years, the myth was that the oil belonged to the people. In reality, under PDVSA, it belonged to the party. Not anymore. The U.S. is effectively foreclosing on the state-run monopoly. We are moving back to a private sector control model where American capital is the only thing allowed to jumpstart the heart of the Orinoco. The assets haven't just been seized. They've been reprivatized at the end of a bayonet. The infrastructure nightmare. In the air-conditioned briefing rooms of Washington, they use phrases like turnkey operation. They talk as if we can just fly in a team of specialists, twist a few rusted valves, and watch the liquid gold start flowing back into the Gulf Coast. But on the ground in Falcon State, the reality isn't a factory. It's an industrial graveyard. This isn't a repair job. It's a total industrial resurrection. Years of corruption, looting for scrap metal, and literal fires have left the heart of Venezuela's refining capacity in cardiac arrest. According to the latest 2026 data from Rystad Energy, the bill for this revival is staggering. We are looking at a minimum of $110 billion just to bring production back to the levels seen 15 years ago. And that is the conservative estimate. If you want to reach that 3 million barrel peak of the late 90s, you're looking at $183 billion. That's not just for rigs and pipes. It's for a complete rebuild of the nation's power grid. You can't pump heavy crude if you can't keep the heating units online. And right now, The Venezuelan grid is held together by scavenged wires and prayers. There is no January 2026 miracle. Reaching 2 million barrels per day isn't a goal for this administration, or even the next. This is a 2032 to 2040 marathon. We're talking about a 15-year investment cycle before this repo even clears its first dollar of profit. The engine block is cracked. And then there's the hold flat cost, the hidden financial trap. The Orinoco is a geological sponge. These fields are heavy, viscous, and under immense pressure. If you stop the pumps, the pressure dies, and the oil turns to solid asphalt in the pipes. To simply keep production at its current, measly 1 million barrels, to simply stand still and prevent the fields from collapsing, requires $6 billion every single year in maintenance capital. That's $6 billion just to stay in the race. If the oil majors don't start spending tomorrow morning, the production they just seized will vanish back into the earth by next year. Every day we wait for a judicious transition is a day the collateral loses value. The repo man has the keys, but he's quickly realizing he just repossessed a high-maintenance wreck that costs a fortune just to keep in the driveway. The BRICS blockade. The capture of Maduro was the climax, but the economic decapitation of his regime began months earlier. By December 2025, the U.S. Navy wasn't just conducting freedom of navigation drills, they were executing a shadow quarantine. It was the largest naval buildup in the region since the mid-90s, centered around the USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Iwo Jima strike groups. This was Operation Southern Spear. By December 17th, the Navy and Coast Guard had effectively throttled the Shadow Fleet, that global dark fleet of zombie tankers that for years had used false transponders and mid-sea transfers to launder Venezuelan oil. We saw vessels like the Skipper and the Centuries intercepted in international waters, their legal cover blown by U.S. surveillance drones. The result was a total logistics bottleneck. In December alone, Venezuelan oil exports plummeted by 36%, crashing to a 17-month low. Over 15 million barrels of crude were forced into floating storage, stuck in a maritime purgatory because no captain was willing to risk a U.S. seizure warrant. China, the single largest buyer of this heavy crude, watched as its supply lines literally evaporated overnight. For a decade, Venezuela was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere. Beijing traded massive loans for barrels. Moscow traded advanced S-300 air defense systems for geopolitical influence. That flip is now complete. Venezuela is no longer a BRICS outpost. Under the Trump Doctrine, it has been converted into a U.S.-run energy protectorate. If you want the Orinoco's heavy crude today, you don't call Moscow anymore. You call Washington. But this isn't just about making enemies. It's about rewarding the right partners. India's state-run giant, ONGC Videsh, has been sitting on nearly $1 billion in stalled dues and unpaid dividends since 2014. Their rigs at the San Cristobal field have been gathering dust, production plummeting from 100,000 barrels down to nearly nothing. Now the math has changed. Under a U.S.-aligned transition, those stalled dues are suddenly back on the table. New Delhi is already eyeing a total restart. Indian refineries, some of the most complex in the world, are desperate for Venezuelan heavy crude to replace the Russian oil they've been forced to buy since the invasion of Ukraine. The blockade wasn't just about stopping ships. It was about clearing the board. The rivals have been evicted. The partners are being vetted. And the U.S. Navy is making sure the new rules of the Orinoco are followed to the very letter.
Venezuela right now. Have you spoken to the newly sworn-in president there, Rodriguez? And what are your thoughts on the entire situation when you said the U.S. would run Venezuela?
We're dealing with the people. We're dealing with the people that just got sworn in. And don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
That means we're in charge.
Have you spoken with her?
We're in charge.
Have you spoken with her?
No, I haven't, but other people.
Do you want to?
Yeah, at the right time I will.
Did the U.S. give Delcy Rodriguez any guarantees in exchange for cooperating
No,
with your
no,
administration?
but she's cooperating.
Are you going to demand free and fair elections in the short term in Venezuela?
Well, it depends on, what you're talking. We have to do one thing in Venezuela, bring it back. It's a dead country right now. It's a country that, frankly, we would have been, if I had lost the election, we would have been a dead country. We would have been Venezuela on steroids. Venezuela right now is a dead country. We have to bring it back, and we're going to have big investments by the oil companies to bring back the infrastructure. And the oil companies are ready to go. They're going to go in, they're going to rebuild the infrastructure. We built it to start off with many years ago. They took it away. You can't do that. And
The Reimbursement Doctrine. This is the turnaround CEO model applied to global geopolitics. Washington isn't calling this a war. They're calling it a restructuring. In the eyes of this administration, Venezuela is a bankrupt corporation with a massive asset base and a failed management team. And like any private equity firm seizing a distressed competitor, the first thing they're doing is charging a management fee. The plan is as clinical as it is controversial. The U.S. Treasury intends to implement a skimming mechanism, a direct deduction from every barrel of Orinoco crude sold on the international market. This isn't just to fix the rusted rigs. It's to pay for the Delta Force raids, the naval blockades of Operation Southern Spear, and the ongoing Absolute Resolve occupation. The logic is simple. The American taxpayer shouldn't have to foot the bill for the liberation of a country sitting on $17 trillion of collateral. But the reimbursement doctrine goes deeper than just covering military costs. It's designed to settle the 20-year-old accounts of companies like Exxon and ConocoPhillips, who were robbed by the Chavez regime. By taking a percentage of the revenue up front, the U.S. is ensuring that its citizens and its corporations are made whole before a single cent reaches the local population. But is it legal? International lawyers at Chatham House and the UN are already sounding the alarm, calling this a dangerous precedent and a flagrant violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, which protects the territorial integrity of sovereign states. They argue you can't just seize a nation's natural resources to pay for the bullets used to capture their leader. The White House, however, has resuscitated a 19th century ghost, the Monroe Doctrine. Specifically, what they're calling the Trump corollary. The State Department's argument is that when a failed state becomes a narco-terrorist hub in the Western Hemisphere, traditional sovereignty is forfeited. In their eyes, the U.S. has a hemispheric duty to step in, clean house, and, crucially, collect the invoice for services rendered. And then there's the question of the safe transition. Trump has stated, "We will run the country until a proper and judicious transition can happen." But look at the fine print. According to the latest briefings, setting an election date is considered premature until the infrastructure is stabilized. It is a circular logic. To fix the oil, you need stability. To get stability, you need a U.S. presence. And as long as there is a U.S. presence, the management fee keeps rolling into the Treasury. The repo man isn't just taking the car. He's charging for the tow, the storage, and the repairs. And he's keeping the keys until the bill is paid in full. Global Glut vs. local boom. January 2026, the oil market wasn't just well supplied, it was drowning. For years, the world lived in fear of peak oil or supply chain fragility. But the reality of the post-Maduro landscape has flipped the script into a crisis of abundance. Here is the math that drives the average consumer crazy. Since the start of the year, Brent crude has plummeted, hitting lows in the high 50s, trading at $57.42. If the capture of Maduro leads to even a partial staged recovery of the Orinoco, we're looking at a $50 barrel by the time the summer driving season kicks in. It's what analysts call the surplus trap. U.S. shale is hitting absolute record highs, and OPEC Plus has effectively thrown in the towel, abandoning its price support strategy to engage in a brutal fight for market share. You're sitting at a red light, looking at $3.45 gasoline and waiting for the miracle, but it isn't coming. Economists call this phenomenon rockets and feathers. When global oil prices spike, gas stations shoot their prices up like a rocket to protect their margins. But when global oil drops, those prices at the pump drift down like a feather. The markets have a bearish bias baked into the next 5 years. J.P. Morgan forecasts that if the U.S. hits its 2 million barrel target in Venezuela, it creates a permanent $4 per barrel downside through 2030. But there is a massive refining paradox at play here that the headlines ignore. This oil isn't destined for your minivan. The Orinoco's heavy sour crude is industrial-grade feedstock. It's the dirty oil that our Gulf Coast refineries crave. They don't want the light, sweet shale from West Texas. They want the thick, sticky sludge from Caracas. Why? Because their multi-billion-dollar crackers in Houston and Lake Charles are optimized to turn that specific heavy sludge into high-margin diesel, jet fuel, and chemical feedstocks. The local boom isn't happening at your neighborhood gas station. It's happening in the industrial hubs of the South. By securing this supply, the U.S. just handed a massive competitive advantage to American refiners. They can now lower their input costs, while global competitors in Europe and Asia are forced to pay a scarcity premium for heavy blends from the Middle East. The repo of Venezuela isn't about saving you $5 at the pump. It's about fueling the reindustrialization of the American machine. The crude is flowing, the surplus is growing, but the profit is staying exactly where the turnaround CEO intended, in the balance sheets of the industrial giants. The Mexico-Iran warning. The global markets didn't just react to the oil sitting in the Orinoco. They reacted to the shadow of the man who took it. By the first week of January 2026, geopolitical risk had a new definition. Investors weren't staying awake at night, wondering if Venezuelan supply would hit the market. They were staying awake, wondering who was next on the list. This is the knock-on effect. In the days following the raid in Caracas, the fear premium didn't just spike for Venezuelan heavy crude, it spiked for Iranian exports and Russian shadow fleets. The message to Tehran was delivered without a single diplomat. Your shadow fleet tankers aren't invisible, and your terminals aren't fortresses. If the United States can snatch a president from his palace in Caracas, your offshore assets are no longer sovereign territory. They are distressed inventory, waiting for a repo team. For the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the seizure of the skipper off the Venezuelan coast wasn't just a lost cargo. It was a total breakdown of their sanctions evasion logistics. Then there's the Mexico angle. The timing wasn't a coincidence. As the 2026 USMCA joint review kicked off, the Venezuela success became the ultimate bargaining chip for Washington. The White House is using the Caracas raid as a clinical blueprint for North American energy policy. The message being sent to Mexico City is deafening. The cartels are running your energy sectors. Your production is failing. Fix it, or we'll fix it for you. It's total leverage. The U.S. is now tying trade renewals directly to anti-cartel operations and the reintegration of the Mexican energy sector into the American grid. The threat is unspoken but clear. Do you want a partnership, or do you want a foreclosure? This is the end of energy neutrality. For 30 years, the world's energy players thought they could play both sides, selling to China, banking in London, and drilling with American technology. Not in 2026. The repo of Venezuela has forced a binary choice upon every energy power on Earth. You are either a client of the U.S. system, protected by its Navy and funded by its banks, or you are a distressed asset waiting to be liquidated. In this new era of American energy dominance, the repo man doesn't negotiate. He just collects. The Petrodollar reset. By seizing Nicolás Maduro on that humid January night, the United States didn't just remove a dictator. They foreclosed on the largest undeveloped hydrocarbon pool on the planet. But the Caracas gambit was never really about the barrels. It was never about today's oil prices or a short-term pump. It was about the next 50 years of American power and the survival of the global financial architecture. In 1974, the petrodollar was born from a secret handshake in Riyadh. It was a deal built on Saudi alliances and the global promise that if you wanted to keep the lights on, you needed the Middle East. And to get their oil, you needed the dollar. For half a century, that arrangement backed the American way of life. But the world of 2026 is multipolar, fractured, and dangerous. Saudi Arabia has joined the BRICS bloc. The old handshake is fraying at the edges. Washington's response was a Western Hemisphere reset. By forcibly bringing 300 billion barrels of Orinoco crude back into the dollar orbit, the U.S. has created a new physical anchor for the Greenback. We are witnessing a transition from a petrodollar built on diplomacy to a petrodollar rebuilt on foreclosures. It is a brutal, high-stakes pivot. But it comes with a price tag that would make a central banker blink. The White House has promised this will cost the taxpayer nothing, claiming the oil majors will foot the bill in exchange for future reimbursements. But in the back rooms of the energy sector, industry experts are deeply skeptical. Is this the start of a new golden age for American energy? Or have we just bought ourselves a $100 billion quagmire? If the oil companies avoid getting screwed, as industry insiders are already whispering, the American taxpayer may ultimately find themselves backstopping the most expensive industrial resurrection in human history. The keys to the vault are now in Washington. The repo man has finished his tactical work, and now the accountants and the lawyers take over. The petrodollar has a new lease on life. But in 2026, that life is backed by cold steel, shadow blockades, and the world's largest oil graveyard. The ledger is open. The collateral is seized. The risk is yours.